All right, now we're going to take a look at the tail for the T-Rex 700X. The entire tail assembly comes pre-assembled from a line. Most of the bolts are loose. You're going to have to apply some sort of thread locker to them. I want to go over the important parts of this. In some ways, this is like a miniature main rotor head. There is a set of thrust bearings inside the tail grip, so we're going to take a look at that first. I'm going to disassemble one of the tail control links here. It's a plastic link up to the tail. There is a brass bushing on the inside here that we have to be careful not to lose, and we're going to be very careful not to get too much thread locker on that when we put it back together. The difference between the main rotor head and the tail is there is no central spindle shaft on the tail, so we can take off one grip at a time. Disassemble here. Once the bolt is out, we can slide the tail grip off. And inside the tail grip here is the exact same thrust bearing setup we see on the main shaft. If I disassemble this, very similar. There's an inner bearing inside the tail grip. There's a thrust bearing marked in right here. We've got the lubricated thrust bearing, which I've already worked on. Here on the outside, we've got a thrust bearing marked out. Okay, I've got my tail shaft thrust bearings back here. Going to reload these into the tail grip. Going to slide this over the tail shaft and reassemble with the grip bolt with thread locker. Goes back together. Tail should rotate nice and free. We come back together and we start reassembly. I mentioned on the tail grip itself, the control link to the tail grip, right here there is a small brass spacer, and I'm going to try to keep the thread locker off of that as much as I can. So I put the bolt on first, and I'm going to bring this back in through the plastic and reassemble into the grip. Now the simplest way to look at this tail assembly, if you can get me, if I can zoom in just a little bit here, bear with me. Okay, as we move in, we're going to want to do each of these sets of bolts in a sequence. So I showed you one grip so far, so we would have thread locked this bolt and the bolt on the end and its associated grip link right here. Both sides will have to be done. The next part that gets done is this small brass screw right here. Each side, these connect the links together. If I look at here, this small screw, it does have a shoulder on it to prevent you from tightening too far. Hopefully we can get some focus on that here in a second. We do have to, this keeps us from over tightening that grip, but at the same time this is a very small screw, so you don't want to get too much tension on it. Sorry, too much coffee today. As we put this back together, this is your grip screw. Now the next thing that we typically would do here is there's two bolts that actually pinch here and here. This bolt and opposite side, this bolt actually pinches the collar. So what I want to do here is actually loosen these two bolts up. Let's start here. These two bolts get loosened. Now this is one of the keys to actually having a smooth moving tail assembly. I've got a 9mm open end wrench. I'm going to take the open end here, and I'm going to unthread the actual tail grips while I do it. Now this is this collar I'm getting to right here. Oops, let me finish on unthreading that. This collar is what actually actuates the entire tail assembly. We're going to do here using a small tip driver is just a tiny bit of thread locker on these threads, like so. I'm going to reassemble this tail grip. I'm going to snug this down without getting too crazy. Make sure everything still moves nice and smooth. Okay, now with that, once that collar has been thread locked, we want to come back in here, take out these black pinch bolts on each side. These are actually what lock this assembly in place. Thread lock here, and these pinch bolts are going to come back in to both sides of the grip. Okay, so we're going to repeat this process for the pinch bolt here. Rotate the unit over, pinch bolt here. The next set of steps you would do in sequence, I'm going to do the bolt on both sides of the slider. You can rotate this over, bolt here. Then I've got an articulated linkage arm here, so we want to do the bolts on both sides of the slider. Then we're going to move to the next set of bolts here and here. Take care of those as a set while we do this. Okay, next will be the bolt holding the actual pitch link arm in place. You'll want to Loctite this bolt. You cannot forget the ball link here, and on the TRX 700X it's installed in the outer of the two holes. So now we've got the pitch link. Now, as we move our way in, so you should have done the bolts on both sides of the slider, the pitch link arm here on the ball link, the pivot links right here. This is a double piece pivot. Now the last thing I'm going to do is actually disassemble this last piece right here just for clarity. I'm going to take out the bolts on both sides here. And what this allows me to do is get the entire assembly out of the way, because what I have to do is I have to disassemble the two bolts here to add thread locker at this pivot point. That's key. We'll assemble that back together. Okay, repeat for the opposite side. So at this point, you should have done these three small bolts right here. Opposite side, same three bolts. We've done all the bolts on the pitch change arms here, the brass and the small bolt going into the grip arm itself. Don't forget to thread lock the actual the grip screw right here that holds the grip onto the tail rotor shaft. And then the final three bolts you're going to have to do are going to be here at the end. These are standard 3mm, 2.5mm driver, 3mm bolts. Two short ones here and one that locks all the way through the tail. This is pretty self-explanatory. The most important part of all of this when you put it together is to make sure you've got a small amount of thread lock on the actual pitch change shaft, this whole collar assembly right here that I disassembled earlier in the video. Make sure you've lubricated the thrust bearings in the tail and that everything moves nice and smooth. You will lubricate this before you fly with Tri-Flow or some other synthetic, but the important point here is this should be silky smooth when it's assembled before you ever put it on the helicopter. Any problems here will result later in a very twitchy tail as the gyro and the servo tries to overcome any sort of friction in this tail mechanism. That's it for the tail. Hopefully that's clear enough. The assembly instructions are actually very good on this. I just wanted to give you a couple tips as we went along.